The klaxon's blare jolted Mason Grey awake, his heart pounding as the ship lurched violently to port. He tumbled from his bunk, crashing against the metal bulkhead before scrambling to his feet. The emergency lights pulsed red, casting eerie shadows across his quarters as the ship's AI repeated its urgent message. Alert! Unknown entities detected in Cargo Bay 3. All security personnel report immediately. Mason wasn't security, but as the only human xenobiologist aboard the interstellar research vessel Horizon, he knew he'd be summoned soon enough. Sure enough, his comm unit buzzed. "Grey, get to Cargo Bay 3 now." Captain Vrexel's gravelly voice came through, the Arcturian's usually composed tone now strained with urgency. "The specimens have escaped," Mason cursed, pulling on his boots. The specimens were the reason they'd diverted to the uncharted moon, in the first place strange quadrupedal creatures with thick, scaly hides that had shown unusual resistance to scanning technology. He'd advised against bringing them aboard, but Captain Vrexel had overruled him, insisting their biology could revolutionize shield technology. He rushed through the corridors, passing panicked crew members running in the opposite direction. When he reached the cargo bay entrance, he found Captain Vrexel and 3 security officers, all Arcturians with their characteristic blue-tinged exoskeletons, preparing to enter. "What happened?" Mason demanded. Vrexel's 4 eyes narrowed at him. "The containment field failed during the power fluctuation. 2 specimens are loose in the bay. I told you the electromagnetic interference they generate could affect our systems," Mason said, fighting to keep accusation from his voice. "Save the lecture, Grey. We need to recapture them before they damage something vital." Vrexel checked his plasma pistol. "These beasts are dangerous. My species encountered similar creatures in the Deneb system centuries ago. Only fire could scare them back." Mason frowned. "Fire on a spaceship?" "Controlled plasma bursts," Vrexel clarified, handing Mason a flamethrower-like device. "Set to minimum, it will generate enough heat and light to mimic fire without damaging the ship's infrastructure." Mason took the device reluctantly. "What about tranquilizers?" "Their hide is too thick, and we don't know enough about their physiology to risk it. Fire is the only reliable deterrent. My ancestors learned this through bitter experience." The cargo bay doors slid open, revealing a chaotic scene. Crates were overturned, and equipment lay scattered across the floor. In the far corner, Mason spotted movement, a large, dark shape shifting between storage containers. The security team moved in formation, plasma tools at the ready. Mason followed, clutching his device, eyes scanning for the second creature. A crash echoed from behind a stack of crates, and suddenly one of the beasts charged. It was larger than Mason remembered, nearly 2 meters at the shoulder, with 6 powerful limbs and a head dominated by a bony crest. Its hide glistened with an iridescent sheen, and its 4 eyes glowed an eerie amber in the emergency lighting. "Fire," Vrexel commanded, activating his plasma tool. A controlled jet of blue flame shot toward the creature. The beast recoiled, hissing as it retreated several steps. The security team pressed forward, creating a semicircle of flame to herd it back toward its containment unit. That's when the second creature attacked from above, dropping from the maintenance scaffolding onto one of the security officers. The Arcturian screamed as powerful jaws clamped onto his exoskeleton. The other officers turned, disrupting their formation and giving the first beast an opening to charge again. "Grey, use your flame," Vrexel shouted, trying to assist his fallen officer. Mason raised the plasma tool, but hesitated. Something about the creature's behavior didn't match what he'd observed earlier. They weren't attacking randomly, they seemed to be protecting something in the corner of the bay. "Wait," he called, but Vrexel and the remaining officers were already firing their plasma tools at both creatures, driving them back with walls of flame. The beasts retreated, but their hissing grew louder, more agitated. Mason noticed their crests beginning to glow, a biofluorescent reaction he hadn't observed before. "Captain, I think we're making them more aggressive." "Nonsense," Vrexel snapped. "My people have dealt with these creatures for generations. Fire is the only thing they fear." The injured security officer was dragged to safety, leaving a trail of bluish fluid from his wounded limb. The creatures had backed into the corner Mason had noted earlier, standing protectively over something he couldn't quite see. "There's something else in that corner," Mason said. "I need to see what it is." "Stay in formation, Grey," Vrexel ordered, but Mason was already moving, circling wide to get a better angle. What he saw made his blood run cold. A nest with 3 smaller versions of the creatures huddled together. "They're protecting their young," he shouted. "That's why they broke out." "Irrelevant," Vrexel replied. "We need to secure them before they damage critical systems." The creature's hissing reached a fever pitch as the Arcturians closed in with their flames. Mason could see the panic in the beast's eyes, the desperate need to protect their offspring. In that moment, Mason made a decision that would change everything. He dropped his plasma tool and stepped between the flames and the creatures. "Grey, what are you doing?" Vrexel's voice rose an octave in alarm. Mason ignored him, focusing instead on the creatures. He remembered something from his studies. Many species across the galaxy responded to vocal displays of dominance. If fire scared them, perhaps it was the roar of the flames rather than the heat that triggered their retreat. Taking a deep breath, Mason let out a roar that started deep in his chest, building to a thunderous bellow that echoed throughout the cargo bay. He made it as loud and threatening as he could, channeling all his frustration and fear into the sound. The creatures froze, their crests flattening against their heads. Mason roared again, even louder this time, the sound reverberating off the metal walls. To his amazement, the creatures began to back away from him, moving away from their young. "What in the 7 moons are you doing?" Vrexel demanded. "They respond to sound, not heat," Mason shouted back. "It's not the fire, it's the roar of the flames that scares them." The creatures continued to retreat, their posture changing from aggressive to submissive. Mason kept up his vocal display, modulating his roars to maintain dominance without appearing to threaten the young ones. Slowly, methodically, he herded the adult creatures back toward their containment unit, roaring whenever they showed signs of resistance. The Arcturians watched in stunned silence as the humans' vocal display proved more effective than their flames. When the adults were finally secured, Mason approached the nest, his movements slow and deliberate. The young creatures cowered but didn't flee. He carefully gathered them, speaking in soft, reassuring tones as he carried them to the containment unit with their parents. Once all the creatures were secured and the containment field re-established, Mason turned to face Vrexel. The captain's 4 eyes were wide with disbelief. "How did you know that would work?" he asked. "I didn't," Mason admitted, "but I observed their behavior. They weren't acting aggressively until we threatened their young with the flames. I figured if they were reacting to something about the fire, it might be the sound rather than the heat." Vrexel's mandibles clicked, an Arcturian expression of thoughtful surprise. "In all our historical records, we've only ever used fire against these creatures. No one ever thought to isolate which aspect of the fire they were responding to." "Sometimes it takes a fresh perspective," Mason said, wincing as he finally noticed a deep gash on his arm where one of the creatures had caught him during the chaos. "Medical team to Cargo Bay 3, Vrexel called into his calm. Then to Mason. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen." Mason managed a tired smile. "In my experience, those two things often go hand in hand." The medical team arrived, led by Dr. Alara Thrix, the ship's Phalosian physician. Her silvery skin shimmered under the lights as she examined Mason's wound. "The laceration is deep," she said, her melodic voice tinged with concern. "What happened here?" "Our human roared louder than flames," Vrexel said, his tone somewhere between irritation and admiration. "Doctor." Thrix raised an eyebrow, a gesture she'd adopted from working with humans. "I'll need the full story while I treat this." As Mason was led to the medical bay, he glanced back at the contained creatures. They had calmed significantly, the adults now curled protectively around their young. He'd have to study them properly now, learn their actual behavioral patterns rather than relying on centuries-old Arcturian assumptions. In the medical bay, Dr. Thrix cleaned and sealed Mason's wound while he explained what had happened. Captain Vrexel joined them midway through the procedure, his posture less rigid than usual. "The creatures are stable," he reported, "and engineering confirms no critical damage to ship systems." "Good," Mason said. "What about the injured security officer?" "Officer Zirek will recover, Doctor," Thrix assured him. "Arcturian exoskeletons are remarkably resilient." Vrexel moved closer, his 4 eyes fixed on Mason. "I've been reviewing our historical records while you were being treated. In all our encounters with these creatures, we always used fire torches in the ancient days, then plasma tools as our technology advanced. No one ever tested sound alone. Sometimes knowledge gets passed down without being questioned," Mason said, wincing as doctor. Thrix applied a regenerative compound to his wound. "Indeed." Vrexel seemed uncomfortable. "I owe you an apology, Grey. Your method was unorthodox but effective, and considerably less dangerous than using flames on a spaceship," Dr. Thrix added dryly. Mason's wound properly treated, he sat up on the examination table. "What I don't understand is why they broke out in the first place. The containment fields should have held." Vrexel's mandibles twitched a sign of embarrassment. "Initial reports suggest the young ones weren't detected when we brought the specimens aboard. The adults broke free when they sensed their offspring were in distress due to the field's frequencies. So they were just trying to protect their family," Mason said quietly. "It would seem so," Vrexel conceded. "Another detail my people overlooked in our encounters with them." Dr. Thrix finished her work, applying a flexible bandage over Mason's wound. "The regenerative compound should speed healing, but you'll need to rest that arm for at least 2 days." "No chance of that," Mason said, already sliding off the table. "I need to study these creatures properly now. If they're intelligent enough to coordinate an escape to protect their young, who knows what else we've missed about them?" Vrexel looked like he wanted to object, but instead nodded reluctantly. "Very well, but you'll have a security detail with you at all times." "Fine," Mason agreed, "but no plasma tools, sound deterrence only." The next 3 days were a revelation. Mason spent every waking hour observing the creatures, which he had started calling resonators, due to their sensitivity to sound frequencies. With careful study and the help of the ship's acoustic specialists, they developed a series of tones that could calm, direct, or deter the creatures without causing distress. On the 4th day, Captain Vrexel called Mason to the bridge. When he arrived, he found not just the captain but also Commander Thalax, the ship's Vendarian science officer, whose transparent cranium revealed the pulsing brain matter that was characteristic of his species. "Grey," Vrexel greeted him. Commander Thalax has analyzed your findings on the resonators. Thalax's brain pulsed with blue-green light, an indication of excitement among Vendarians. Fascinating work, Dr. Grey. Your discovery about their auditory sensitivity has implications beyond just handling these creatures. What do you mean? Mason asked. Their ability to generate and respond to specific frequencies explains the electromagnetic interference we detected, Thalax explained. It's not random, it's communication. They're literally speaking to each other through electromagnetic pulses. Mason's excitement built. That's why they disrupted our systems when we separated them. They were calling to each other. Precisely, Thalax said. And more importantly, we believe we can adapt this principle to create a new type of non-violent deterrent system for multiple species. Vrexel stepped forward. The Arcturian Science Council has reviewed your preliminary findings. They are impressed, Grey, and somewhat embarrassed that for centuries, we've been needlessly using fire against creatures that could have been handled with simple sound. Mason felt a surge of pride, but also humility. It was just a hunch based on observation. A hunch that could revolutionize how we approach potentially dangerous species encounters, Vrexel said. The Council wants us to return to Arcturian space immediately to present your findings. What about the resonators? Mason asked. That's what I wanted to discuss, Vrexel said, his tone growing serious. Our mission was to collect specimens for study, but given what we now know about their intelligence and family structures, we can't separate them from their young, Mason finished, or keep them in captivity for extended periods. No, Vrexel agreed, surprising Mason. We can't. The ethical protocols are clear once sentience or proto-sentience is established. So we'll return them to their moon. Vrexel's mandibles clicked in affirmation. After we document everything we can non-invasively, Commander Thalax believes we can develop the deterrent technology based on the data we already have, without needing to keep the specimens. Mason couldn't hide his smile. Thank you, Captain. I think that's the right call. Don't thank me yet, Vrexel warned. You're going to be very busy explaining to a roomful of Arcturian scientists how a human roar proved more effective than centuries of our fire-based tactics. Mason laughed. I'm looking forward to it. The Horizon changed course, heading first to return the resonators to their home moon. Mason spent the journey refining his understanding of the creatures, developing a comprehensive guide to their vocalizations and behaviors. When they reached the moon, Mason insisted on personally overseeing the release. Standing in the cargo bay as the ramp lowered to the rocky surface, he watched as the family of resonators cautiously emerged from their containment unit. The adult creatures paused at the edge of the ramp, turning their crested heads toward Mason. For a moment, he thought they might charge, but instead, the larger one, which he determined was female, emitted a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through his bones. What was that? Vrexel asked, standing a safe distance behind him. I think, Mason said slowly, it was a thank you. The resonators descended the ramp, the adults guiding their young with gentle nudges. They paused once more at the base, looking back at the ship, before disappearing into the rocky terrain of their home. Mason felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to find Dr. Thrix beside him. You did good work here, she said. Not many would have thought to try understanding them rather than just containing them. It's why I became a xenobiologist, Mason replied. To find the bridges between species, not the barriers. The journey to Arcturus took another 2 weeks, during which Mason prepared his presentation for the Science Council. When they finally arrived, he was surprised by the reception. Not just Arcturian scientists, but representatives from a dozen species were waiting to hear about the discovery. The presentation chamber was vast, designed to accommodate beings of all sizes and environmental needs. Mason stood on the central platform, surrounded by holographic displays of his data on the resonators. For generations, he began, the Arcturian approach to these creatures was based on a partial truth that fire would drive them away. But as we discovered, it wasn't the heat or light of the flames that deterred them, but the sound. He played recordings of the resonators' vocalizations, demonstrating how they communicated through both audible sounds and electromagnetic frequencies. When threatened, they respond to dominance displays, particularly loud, low-frequency sounds like the roar of flames, or, as we discovered. He paused, a little embarrassed. Like a human yell, murmurs rippled through the audience. An elderly Arcturian scientist raised a hand. Are you suggesting that human vocal capabilities exceed the deterrent effect of our traditional methods? Mason chose his words carefully. Not inherently, no. But in this specific case, the focused sound wave of a human voice at maximum volume created a more targeted deterrent than the dispersed noise of flames. It's not about one species being superior to another, it's about finding the right tool for each situation. This seemed to satisfy the Arcturian, who nodded thoughtfully. Captain Vrexel stepped forward. Dr. Grey's discovery has led to a revolutionary understanding of these creatures, which we now call resonators. More importantly, it has reminded us of a valuable lesson. Assumptions passed down through generations should always be subject to fresh observation and analysis. The presentation continued for hours, with Mason fielding questions from scientists of all species. By the end, the Arcturian Science Council had approved funding for a dedicated resonator research program, one that would study them in their natural habitat rather than in captivity. As the chamber emptied, Vrexel approached Mason. The council is impressed. They've requested that you lead the research program. Mason blinked in surprise. Me? But I'm not Arcturian. Precisely why they want you, Vrexel said. Your fresh perspective proved invaluable. Sometimes it takes an outsider to see what those steeped in tradition cannot. I don't know what to say, Mason admitted. Say yes, Dr. Thrick suggested, joining them. The Horizon would be assigned as your research vessel, with most of the current crew staying on if they choose. Mason looked between them, these aliens who had become his colleagues and friends over the past months. In that case, how could I refuse? The following months were a whirlwind of activity. The Horizon was refitted with specialized equipment for studying the resonators non-invasively. New crew members joined, including specialists in xenoacoustics and electromagnetic communication. 6 months after the initial discovery, they returned to the Moon, setting up a research base a safe distance from the main resonator territory. Through patience and careful observation, they began to map out the creature's social structures, communication patterns, and behaviors. Mason was recording observations one evening when Captain Vrexel found him at his monitoring station. Still working? The Arcturian asked. Just finishing up today's notes, Mason replied. We've identified 14 distinct vocalizations so far, each with specific meanings. Vrexel settled beside him, his exoskeleton creaking slightly. I've been meaning to ask you something, Grey. That day in the cargo bay, were you truly confident your roar would work, or was it desperation? Mason chuckled. A bit of both, honestly. I had a theory, but I was also out of options. You risked your life on a theory. Sometimes that's all science is, Mason said. Making your best guess based on available data, then being brave enough to test it. Vrexel was quiet for a moment. In Arcturian culture, we have a concept called Vrextat, the wisdom to question what everyone knows to be true. It's considered one of the highest virtues, yet one of the hardest to practice. You demonstrated it that day." "I'm honored," Mason said, genuinely touched. "Though I have to admit, roaring at alien creatures wasn't covered in my xenobiology training." "Perhaps it should be," Vrexel said, his mandibles clicking in what Mason now recognized as the Arcturian equivalent of a smile. "The Council has requested we develop a formal protocol based on your approach. They're calling it the Grey method of non-violent species deterrence." Mason laughed. "That's going to look interesting on my resume." A notification chimed on his monitor, movement detected in the observation zone. Both men turned their attention to the screen, where a family of resonators had emerged from their burrow. "Look," Mason said quietly, "the juveniles have grown." The young resonators, now nearly as large as their parents, were practicing their vocalizations, their crests glowing with biofluorescent patterns as they communicated. "They're beautiful," Vrexel admitted. "I can't believe my people only ever saw them as threats to be driven away with fire." "That's the thing about fear," Mason said. "It makes us miss the beauty right in front of us." As they watched, the largest resonator suddenly raised its head, turning toward the hidden camera. It let out a low, rumbling call, the same one Mason had heard when they released the family months ago. "It knows we're watching," Vrexel said, astonished. "Not just knows," Mason corrected, checking his readings. "It's communicating. That specific frequency pattern, we've seen it before when resonators greet each other after separation." "They're greeting us," Vrexel sounded skeptical. "I think they are," Mason said. "I think they remember." On an impulse, Mason activated the external speaker system. Taking a deep breath, he let out a gentler version of the roar he'd used that day in the cargo bay, modified based on what they'd learned about resonator communication patterns. On the screen, the resonators perked up, their crests glowing brighter. After a moment, they responded with a chorus of calls that the computer translated as non-threatening. "Remarkable," Vrexel whispered. "They do remember." "It's more than that," Mason said, studying the readings. "They're inviting communication. They're curious about us." Vrexel's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of deep thought among Arcturians. "So we came here to study them. And they're studying us right back," Mason finished, grinning. "Isn't that exactly what makes this job amazing?" For the next year, the research team made breakthrough after breakthrough in understanding resonator society. They discovered the creatures had a complex social structure, with families joining into larger groups for mutual protection. Their electromagnetic communication allowed them to coordinate over vast distances, explaining how they'd survived on a moon with limited resources. Most surprisingly, they showed signs of tool use, using specific rocks to amplify their communications, effectively creating natural transmitters to call distant groups. The Arcturian Science Council published Mason's findings to acclaim across the scientific community. What had begun as a cargo bay crisis had evolved into one of the most significant xenobiological discoveries in decades. On the anniversary of their first encounter with the resonators, Mason stood at the observation post, watching as a large gathering of the creatures performed what the team had come to recognize as a seasonal migration ritual. Beside him stood Captain Vrexel, now Admiral Vrexel, following his promotion for supporting the groundbreaking research. "I received a message from the Council today," Vrexel said. "They're declaring this moon a protected zone. No hunting, no specimen collection." "That's wonderful news," Mason said. "They've also formally reclassified the resonators as proto-sentient, with all the protections that entails." Vrexel turned to Mason. "All because you roared instead of using fire." Mason shook his head. "All because we took the time to understand instead of just react." Below them, the resonators began a complex series of vocalizations, their crests lighting up the twilight in patterns of blue and green. The sound carried across the rocky landscape, echoing back from distant ridges. "What are they saying?" Vrexel asked. Mason consulted his translator. "It's complex, but the general meaning is something like we journey together under the same sky. Poetic, for creatures we once thought were just mindless beasts." "I've found that's often the case," Mason said. "The universe is full of intelligence we fail to recognize simply because it doesn't look like our own." As if to punctuate his point, the largest resonator, the one Mason had come to recognize, as the group's leader turned toward the observation post and let out a single, clear call. The translator displayed a simple message: "Safe journey." "They know we're leaving?" Vrexel asked. "We've been packing up equipment for days. They're observant," Mason smiled, "and maybe a little more aware than we've given them credit for." Mason activated the external speaker one last time. Instead of a roar, he sent a gentle, modulated response that the team had developed for positive communication, a sound that conveyed peace and respect in resonator terms. The leader dipped its crested head in what looked remarkably like acknowledgement, before turning to lead its family over the horizon. "You know," Vrexel said as they watched the creatures disappear, "in all the ancient Arcturian texts about these creatures, they were always portrayed as monsters to be feared and driven away. But now, I wonder if our ancestors simply never took the time to listen." "It's a universal failing," Mason replied. "Fear makes us reach for fire when sometimes all we need is understanding." "And occasionally," Vrexel added, his mandibles clicking in amusement, "a human willing to roar louder than flames." Mason laughed. "I'm never going to live that down, am I?" "Not as long as I'm your admiral," Vrexel confirmed. As they prepared to leave the moon for the final time, Mason took one last look at the landscape where he'd made the discovery that changed his career and challenged centuries of Arcturian wisdom. He thought about how a moment of desperation had led to understanding, how a roar had accomplished what fire never could. In the grand tradition of science, it had taken someone willing to question established knowledge to literally stand between fire and fear, to find a new path forward. Not just for humans or Arcturians, but for the resonators as well. The horizon lifted off, leaving behind a permanent monitoring station that would continue to study and protect the resonators from a respectful distance. As the moon receded from view, Mason felt a sense of completion. The creatures were safe, their intelligence recognized, their world protected. All because, in a critical moment, he discovered that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe wasn't technology or fire, or even knowledge passed down through generations. Sometimes, it was simply the courage to try something new, even if that something was as basic as a human voice, roaring louder than flames.